Every morning, a lonely old man whose children lived far away would stroll to the park and sit on his favorite bench by the lake to enjoy the fresh air. Until one morning, he discovered his spot had been claimed, not by a person, but by a bobcat. Remembering the warnings about never approaching wild bobcats, he kept his distance. Determined to reclaim his bench, he tried clapping his hands, stomping his feet, and even bringing food and playing recordings of a female bobcat in heat. But nothing worked. The bobcat simply opened its eyes, gave him a sideways glance, and continued lounging, belly up, perfectly content to keep sunbathing. He thought this creature had stolen his only remaining comfort, but he had no idea it was about to give him back something far more precious. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Every morning for the better part of a year, Henry had walked the same path through the sleepy park at the edge of his small town. The air in the pre-dawn hours carried the smells of dew and pine sap, and the mist that rose from the lake floated like a veil across the grass. A gentle slope led down to the water, where a bench overlooked the rippling surface. Henry always stopped there. Decades earlier, he and his late wife had carved their initials into its arm, and even after cancer took her, he found himself drawn back to that spot. Sitting there gave him the illusion that she might slip her hand into his and whisper a joke about the ducks. In those first months after she passed, grief had been a weight that pressed his shoulders toward the earth, and the bench was the one place he let it settle. Although his children called when they could, they lived across the country. Henry's days were a patchwork of errands and small rituals. He tended to a few tomato plants, read the paper at the diner, and volunteered at the library on Tuesdays. The mornings at the bench were different. Quiet hours when the world still belonged to birdsong and the hum of insects. He would trace his fingers across the initials he and his wife had carved decades ago, feeling the grooves like the lines in his own palms. Sometimes he would close his eyes and hear again the faint peal of his wife's laughter, or feel the phantom warmth of her shoulder against his. On the way to the lake, he often glanced at posted notices warning walkers to keep a safe distance from the bobcats that sometimes roamed the wooded edges. He knew bobcats were secretive animals with tufted ears and spotted coats, larger than the alley cats that prowled his neighborhood. As a younger man, he and his wife had volunteered at a wildlife rehabilitation center, so he understood the difference between a wild animal and a pet. He respected the warnings, but in truth, he had never seen a bobcat in the park. In the small hours, when the sky was just beginning to blush, he would shuffle along the gravel path, tap his cane against his boot to scare off snakes, and hum an old love song. The bench at the end of the path always waited, empty, a promise of a few minutes' peace. One morning in late summer, the pattern broke. Henry topped the final rise and froze. Draped across the sun-warmed planks of his bench was a muscular, tawny body, tail twitching lazily. The bobcat's ears were rimmed in black, with tufts that gave it an almost regal look. Its amber eyes were half closed, and its white belly fur rose and fell with each slow breath. For an instant, Henry's heart kicked against his ribs. All those warnings flooded back. Never approach, never feed, never forget they are wild. But it was his bench, his ritual, the one ritual that still anchored him. The animal's presence was an intrusion, a thief in broad daylight lying across sacred ground. Henry swallowed and clutched his thermos tighter, and he had no idea what to do next. Instinct told him to make noise and scare the animal away. He stamped his boots, clapped his hands, and even whistled the shrill tune he used to shoo sparrows from his garden. The bobcat didn't budge. Its eyes opened for a blink and then slid closed again as if bored by the commotion. Henry tried to remember the advice from the old conservation pamphlets. Make yourself big, avoid eye contact, back away slowly. He waved his arms, and the cat flicked one ear in acknowledgement but otherwise kept basking in the patch of morning sun. A part of Henry was amused at the creature's arrogance. Another part simmered with irritation. That bench was more than wood and metal. It was a place where he still felt close to his wife. Who or what had the right to take that away? He shuffled closer, heart pounding. "Shoo," he whispered first, then louder, then finally shouted, "Off with you." The bobcat yawned, revealing impressive canines, but remained stretched full length, paws dangling over the edge. Determined, Henry rummaged in his jacket pocket for the slice of dried turkey he always carried to feed the mallards. He tossed it near the cat's nose. The meat lay untouched in the grass. He pulled up on his phone a recording of a female bobcat call, something he had once heard on a nature program, and held it up. The electronic yowls crackled through the air. The sunbather didn't even twitch. Minutes ticked by. Henry's frustration began to dissolve into reluctant admiration. How many creatures in the world could so wholly ignore a human? The bobcat's complete confidence in its right to occupy that space made Henry wonder if perhaps he had stumbled into its daily routine rather than the other way around. He considered turning around and going home, but pride rooted him to the spot. The memory of his wife's smiling eyes held him there too. He took a deep breath, and with more bravado than sense, sat down slowly on the far edge of the bench. The wood creaked under his weight. He braced himself for a hiss or a swipe. Instead, the bobcat cracked one eye open, regarded him for a moment, then returned its gaze to the shimmering lake. Its tail gave one thump of the tip as if to say, "Very well, we share." Henry let his breath out in a shaky laugh. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the shock of how ordinary it suddenly felt to be sitting next to a wild thing. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Henry adjusted his position cautiously, acutely aware of the animal's breath and the warmth radiating from its flank. Emboldened by the cat's indifference, he allowed his hand to drift a little closer, hovering just over the soft fur of its belly. It was ridiculous. He knew this, but the belly was exposed, a universal invitation in the language of cats. "You are daft," he whispered to himself, then brushed his calloused fingers along the white fur. The bobcat's skin quivered at the light touch, and then, against every warning Henry had ever heard, it began to purr. The rumbling vibration traveled up Henry's fingertips and spread warmth through his chest. Tears sprang unbidden to his eyes. The sound was so similar to his old tabby's purr in the years after his children left home that a flood of memories washed over him. Sitting there in the golden light, with the lake sighing and a wild heart beating under his palm, he felt alive and seen for the first time in months. What began as a single strange morning soon became a ritual all its own. The next day, and the day after, Henry found the bobcat waiting on the bench, stretched along the planks like a queen on her throne. He started setting his alarm a little earlier, eager not to keep his new companion waiting. They fell into a rhythm. Henry would pour his coffee from his thermos, offer up a polite "good morning," and gingerly pat the cat's flank. The bobcat, in turn, would roll onto its back and purr in response to belly rubs. After 20 minutes or so, when the sun climbed higher and joggers appeared on the path, the animal would rise, shake out its coat, and vanish into the trees with liquid grace. Henry would watch it leave, wipe stray fur from his trousers, and smile at his good fortune. He found himself talking to the cat as if it understood. He told it about the neighbor's barking dog that kept him up the night before, about the letter his granddaughter had sent from college, about the tomatoes that refused to ripen on time. It was easier to speak aloud to a creature that could not answer than to fill the silence of his empty house. He confided things he hadn't told anyone, how he still set a place for his wife at the table on Sundays, and how the sight of her favorite mug sometimes unraveled him. "You'd have liked her," he whispered one morning, his hand lost in the bobcat's thick ruff. "She had a way with strays." The golden eyes blinked slowly, and the purrs grew louder, a small symphony of comfort. As the days turned into weeks, Henry began to recognize patterns in his companion. The bobcat would often arrive at the park just before dawn, its coat damp from the grass and whiskers glistening with dew. He noted the faint scar across its nose and wondered what fight had left its mark. Its ears would swivel toward every snap of a twig, even as its body remained limp under his touch. Sometimes it arrived with the smell of musk and pine resin clinging to its fur, evidence of nights spent prowling through the forested hills beyond town. Other times its paws were dusty, suggesting it had wandered near the road. Henry took mental notes like a scientist, fascinated by the glimpses into a life that intersected with his for only a brief window each day. Neighbors began to take notice of the unusual pair. Early morning walkers would peer curiously through the trees, phones held up like shields to record the wild cat lounging beside the old man. Some gasped and whispered about danger, others crossed to the far side of the path. A teenage boy with earbuds in and a skateboard under his arm stopped once to stare openly. "That thing will bite your hand off," he warned. Henry merely shrugged. "She hasn't yet," he said, surprising himself by the pronoun. In the evenings, he researched bobcat behavior on the library computer. He learned that purring can signal contentment in wild cats, and that they sometimes become habituated to human presence when their territory overlaps with quiet parks. He knew not to give it food or attempt to confine it. Respecting its autonomy was part of the unspoken agreement between them. His children thought he had lost his mind. When Henry mentioned the bobcat during their weekly video call, his son's eyebrows shot up. "Dad, you can't just sit with a wild predator," he said. His daughter chimed in from her sun-drenched kitchen, a toddler on her hip. "Promise you'll call animal control if it does anything weird. We don't need another emergency with you." Henry chuckled and changed the subject. How could he explain that the animal had become a balm for his loneliness, a bridge to memories that had begun to fade? The bobcat's steady companionship made the empty spaces in his day feel less cavernous. He felt an excitement he hadn't known in years, something akin to a boyhood secret, a hidden friend waiting in the dawn. Over time, Henry's curiosity about his bench partner deepened into a gentle reverence. He named the bobcat Sunbeam in his mind, after the way its coat caught the morning light, though he never dared to call it out loud. He began bringing a small notebook with him, jotting down observations. The angle of the animal's ears when a hawk screamed overhead, the way its whiskers fanned when the breeze shifted, the fact that it preferred the left side of the bench and tolerated his presence only on the right. He marveled at the paradox of such grace paired with such power. Sunbeam's shoulders rippled with muscle under its spotted fur, yet it melted into a puddle of purring softness at the slightest touch. Henry wondered if the cat, too, found some comfort in his steady presence, a respite from the constant vigilance of the wild. Some mornings the bobcat arrived with tiny burrs tangled in its coat. On one of those mornings, Henry contemplated whether to remove them. He knew to avoid interfering with wild animals, and yet the burrs seemed to tug painfully when the animal moved. "Hold still, my friend," Henry murmured. He reached carefully and plucked one burr free. The cat's ear flicked back, but it did not move. He removed another burr and then another, creating a neat little pile on the bench between them. When he finished, Sunbeam stretched luxuriously, twisted its body, and licked Henry's knuckles once with its raspy tongue. A gesture so quick and unexpected that Henry laughed aloud. It was the first time the cat had initiated contact. After that day, the bobcat would occasionally bump its head against his thigh or rest its chin on his knee. The boundary between human and wild seemed to blur, not in ownership, but in recognition. One windy afternoon, Henry noticed a slight hitch in the bobcat's gait as it hopped up onto the bench. Concern tightened his chest. "You all right?" he whispered, as if the creature understood English. The bobcat's flank trembled when it lay down. He considered calling the Wildlife Rescue Center. He still had a laminated card with their number from his volunteer days. But by the next morning, the limp was gone, and the cat leapt up with its usual elegance. It dawned on Henry that this animal had survived storms, droughts, and rival predators long before it ever met him. His role was not savior, but witness. He could offer companionship and a warm hand, but he could not keep Sunbeam safe from all of life's dangers. Nor should he. During one particularly rainy week, the bobcat did not appear for 3 days. Henry tried to be rational. Wild animals have large territories, he told himself. They hunt, they roam, they avoid the downpour. Still, he felt a hollow ache each morning when he sat on the bare, damp bench, his hand falling to the empty space where fur usually waited. He found himself scanning the tree line on his way to the grocery store, peering under shrubs in his own yard, listening for a familiar rustle. He realized how deeply the bobcat had woven itself into the fabric of his days. It was not until the rain broke and a clear dawn painted the lake pink that Sunbeam padded up again, shaking drops from its whiskers and settling with a huff. "You gave me quite a scare," Henry scolded, wiping moisture from the animal's fur. The bobcat yawned and rolled over, offering its belly as though apologizing. Through these cycles of absence and return, Henry found himself confronting his own notions of attachment. He had spent so much of his life trying to hold on, first to his children, then to his wife's memory, and now to a wild bobcat. Each time he tried to grip too tightly, life slipped through his fingers like sand. Sitting beside Sunbeam taught him the beauty of simply being present without expectation. He learned to savor moments for what they were rather than mourn what they could not be. He recalled his wife's favorite saying, "You don't own the sunrise, you just watch it." And so, morning after morning, he watched the sunrise with a creature who owed him nothing and yet kept returning. Then, one crisp morning as summer waned and the first hints of gold tipped the leaves, the routine fractured. Henry arrived at the lake as always, thermos steaming in his hand, but the bench was empty. He waited longer than usual, drumming his fingers on the wood. An hour passed. A pair of kayakers glided across the water. The sun climbed higher. Still no bobcat. The ache that bloomed in Henry's chest was sharp and familiar, a cousin to the grief he'd known years before. He told himself not to panic, that wild creatures wander. But when Sunbeam failed to show the next day and the next, worry gnawed at him like a squirrel at a pine cone. Unable to shake the feeling that something had changed, Henry decided to investigate. The small cafe near the park kept a security camera aimed at the lakeshore to deter vandals. Henry had befriended the owner, a kindly woman named Marisol, and he hesitated only a moment before asking if he could review the footage. Marisol agreed, curiosity gleaming in her eyes. Together, they scrolled through days of silent, grainy recordings. There was Sunbeam at dawn, trotting in from the tree line, snatching a rabbit near the shore, then leaping onto the bench and stretching luxuriously. In clip after clip, Henry arrived, sat down, and gently rubbed the cat's belly. The two would sit together in peace until mid-morning, when the bobcat would melt back into the trees. Henry felt a swell of affection watching their companionship from a third person's view. It looked almost like a scene from a film. When they reached the recording from the last day he had seen Sunbeam at the bench, Henry leaned closer. He watched himself stand after their usual time together, pat his knee in farewell, and walk up the path. The bobcat remained on the bench for a moment, eyes following him. Then, as soon as Henry disappeared from frame, the cat rose, stretched, and hopped down. Instead of slipping back into the woods, it trotted up the path in the same direction Henry had gone. "It followed me?" Henry murmured. His pulse quickened. The footage answered him. The bobcat paused at the edge of the camera's view, looked back at the lake for the briefest instant, and then disappeared up the hill. That night, Henry lay awake, replaying the image in his mind. Where had it gone? After a restless night, he decided to take a longer route home from the park, tracing the bobcat's possible path. He examined bushes for tracks, looked beneath his carport, and peered into the overgrown hedges along the back fence. As he rounded his house, he froze at the sight of a tawny shape sprawled across an old wooden bench in his backyard. For years, that bench had sat unused among the wildflowers and weeds. It was the very place he and his wife had shared countless afternoon coffees, where they planned trips and whispered secrets under the shade of a maple tree. Since her death, he had avoided it, unable to bear the emptiness of sitting there alone. Now, on the weathered slats, Sunbeam lay stretched full length, eyes closed, tail twitching contentedly. Henry's hand flew to his mouth. The world seemed to tilt. He stepped forward, feeling tears sting his eyes. "You found me," he whispered, voice cracking. The bobcat lifted its head, looked at him with those amber eyes, and gave a slow blink, the same blink of trust it offered at the lake. Henry sat down gingerly beside the cat. The bench groaned under the combined weight, but he did not care. Memories of his wife flooded him. The way she would lean against his shoulder on this very bench. The way her hair smelled like lilacs in the spring. Beside him now, a wild creature pressed its warm flank against his hip and began to purr. The sound resonated through the slats, through Henry's bones, through the ghosts that haunted his backyard. He wept openly, tears rolling down weathered cheeks and catching in his white beard. In that moment, grief and gratitude intertwined. The bench that had once represented loss now held new life and healing. In the days that followed, Henry's world expanded in ways he had not expected. Sunbeam continued to nap on the garden bench in the afternoons, and sometimes still met him at the lake in the mornings. The circle of their shared spaces widened, encompassing both of the benches where Henry had loved most deeply. The old man began to spend more time in his neglected backyard, pruning the rose bushes his wife had planted, pulling weeds from between the flagstones. When neighbors peered over the fence, they saw an elderly man in overalls chatting quietly with a sleek, spotted cat that sprawled with an almost smug ease under the maple tree. The sight became a topic of whispered admiration and admonition. Some suggested he call animal control. Others smiled and said perhaps the universe had given him a companion in his twilight years. Inspired by this unexpected friendship, Henry reached out to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where he and his wife had once volunteered. He told the staff about the bobcat, about the park bench, and about the mysterious shift to his backyard. They listened intently. One young biologist explained that bobcats are territorial yet curious, and that forming loose associations with humans in suburban areas is not unheard of when those humans pose no threat. Keep your distance when it wants space. Don't feed it, and remember it is still wild, she advised. Henry nodded. He felt a responsibility to honor the creature's nature even as he cherished its presence. On weekends, he began volunteering again, cleaning enclosures and feeding injured owls. Surrounded by raccoons with bandaged paws and deer fawns wrapped in blankets, he found renewed purpose. The story of the old man and the bobcat traveled beyond the neighborhood. A local newspaper ran a piece about their unlikely bond, complete with a photo of Henry sitting on his backyard bench, sunbeams sprawled across his lap. Comments flooded the paper's website, some scolding him for endangering himself, others sharing tales of unexpected connections with wildlife. An elementary school teacher invited Henry to speak to her class via video chat. He told the children about respecting wild animals, about never attempting to domesticate them, and about the importance of habitat conservation. The children asked the sorts of questions only 8-year-olds can ask. "Does she bring you presents like my cat does?" one girl wanted to know. Henry laughed. "No dead mice on my doorstep yet," he replied. At home, Henry found himself speaking out loud again, not only to the bobcat, but to his wife's memory. While he weeded or trimmed the hedge, he would recount the day's events. "Remember when you kept trying to tame that stray tom?" he would say, and then glance over at Sunbeam, who blinked as if in on the joke. The boundaries between past and present softened. Pain still pricked at unexpected times, but it no longer consumed him. The presence of the bobcat had opened a door he had closed long ago. Through that door came light, laughter, and a community that rallied around him in curiosity and care. There were moments of tension, too. One autumn afternoon, a neighbor's golden retriever slipped its leash and bounded into Henry's yard, barking excitedly. Sunbeam's ears flattened, and it bolted up the maple tree in 2 astonishing leaps. Henry's heart pounded as he chased the dog away and apologized to the cat. The bobcat remained in the branches for hours, staring down with wary eyes. Henry sat in a lawn chair under the tree until dusk, humming the old love song he had often sung at the lake. Eventually, the cat descended, keeping its distance. Henry learned that trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild, even with a wild friend. As winter approached, the mornings grew colder. Frost sparkled on the grass, and the lake's surface sometimes wore a thin layer of ice. Henry knitted himself a wool cap and pulled his wife's old quilted coat tighter around his shoulders. Sunbeam's coat thickened, and the bobcat began spending more of its time deep in the sheltering brush beyond the yard. The frequency of their meetings decreased. Some days Henry sat alone on the backyard bench with his thermos while the bare branches above him trembled in the wind. He missed the solid warmth pressed against his hip and the steady rumble of the purr that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. But instead of feeling abandoned, he felt a quiet acceptance. It was the same acceptance he had learned at the lake, that all things, including companionship, ebb and flow. On those solitary mornings, Henry would close his eyes and picture the seasons that had passed. He remembered the first startled sight of the bobcat on the park bench, the tentative belly rubs, the blossoming sense of wonder. He recalled the thrill of discovering Sunbeam in his yard, the cathartic tears he had shed, and the way grief had eased its grip as he tended his wife's roses again. He saw himself speaking to schoolchildren, scrubbing out cages at the rehabilitation center, and laughing with neighbors over the fence. He saw a life that had expanded beyond his small routines. He realized that the Bobcat had not filled the hole left by his wife's absence. Nothing could. Instead, it had shown him how to live alongside that emptiness, to allow joy and sorrow to coexist. In early spring, when the first crocuses pushed through the soil and robins began to sing again, Henry awoke one morning to find Sunbeam curled up on the garden bench, nose tucked under its tail. He felt a burst of childish glee. He boiled water for tea and carried 2 mugs outside, placing one on the bench as though the cat might drink. The Bobcat stretched, extended a paw to bat at the steam rising from the cup, and then settled its head in Henry's lap. As he ran his fingers through the thick fur, he thought about his wife's words from years ago, spoken as they watched a sunset together. Life has a way of giving us what we need even when we don't know to ask. He smiled at the memory and at the living weight warming his legs. Eventually, as all wild things do, Sunbeam came less and less. The last time Henry saw the Bobcat, it was midsummer. Fireflies blinked above the yard like tiny stars. The cat lay beside him, belly exposed, purring softly. He knew, in the quiet way one knows certain truths, that this would be their final evening together. He stroked the silky fur, committing every tuft and spot to memory. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The Bobcat blinked, then rose, gave his hand one last nudge, and disappeared into the shadows. Henry sat there long after the purr faded, staring into the darkness. Sadness sat beside him, but it did not crush him. In the years that followed, Henry continued his morning walks to the lake. He kept volunteering, kept tending his garden, kept telling the story of the time a Bobcat stole his seat and refused to leave, but gave him something that changed his life forever. The tale became legend in his town, passed down and embellished, yet the heart of it remained true. Sometimes, when a warm ray of sun fell across his knee on the bench, he could almost feel the weight of a body beside him and hear a faint purr. He would close his eyes and smile, grateful for the wild visitor who had taught him that letting go can lead to unexpected connections, that grief and joy can occupy the same space, and that love often arrives in forms we could never have imagined.